Adventure Time is an animated series that aired from 2010 to 2018. In the world of Western animation, it's often considered a pioneer of the overarching plot-focused narrative that's almost become the default in present-day cartoons. It has a fascinating and creative setting, endearing humor that's almost aged into the surreal, lovable and multifaceted characters, and a unique and engaging storytelling method that follows its protagonist and the world around him through the entirety of his adolescence. I experienced the entirety of the show shortly after the finale aired exactly 4 years ago now, and one of my friends begged me to watch it with them. Looking back, I'm very glad I did. I've always been an avid cartoon fan, but since then, to me Adventure Time has been something special, impossible to recreate. But as much as I love to, I'm not here to talk about why Adventure Time is so great. I want to talk about Season 10. To be perfectly clear, I actually don't hate the final season, not by a long shot. In particular, I quite enjoy the plot point of Peepy's relatives coming back to haunt her as a final hurrah to her character arc in typical Adventure Time random plot development fashion. However, this season suffers primarily from serious pacing issues, which are not helped by the season's ridiculously short episode count. Pacing issues then beget underdeveloped characters, villain and hero alike, and a feeling of disinterest in the story's progression, especially because this season's conflict has by far the largest scale in the show's run. As an example, what do we know about Gumbaldia? We know Gumball rules it, but how does it operate differently from the Candy Kingdom? Why is it, or is it not, a threat or inconvenience to anyone besides Princess Bubblegum? Do we know its structure and government, like how we know the Candy Kingdom's apartment district and the inner workings of its police force? Do we know how Gumball treats his subjects? What do they think about the conflict? In what ways are they different from the Candy Kingdom citizens, considering Gumball's opinion of his niece's ruling methods? Expecting to be given the answers to every single one of these questions, even in one regularly sized season, is a little absurd, but when introducing an entirely new faction to your narrative, I think it's alarming to not know even a single one. Obviously, this is a result of an absolutely pitiful episode count. This might not seem like a huge issue at first because many Adventure Time plots are contained within just a couple episodes, so why would Season 10 be any different? Except, it is a little different. I think many of these previous major plot events are given greater leeway because they are much smaller in narrative scale. Like, Finn learning his biological father is still alive is a huge deal, but it's also one that's confined primarily to Finn and his future behavior. The addition of 3 new antagonistic forces who bring to the table an entirely new faction involves the reaction and involvement of an entire region that is just not possible to properly explore without more runtime. In fact, many of these world-building related unknowns don't even require direct confrontation, they're organically woven into existing episodes. Like, how did we find out that the Candy Kingdom had a broken down night district? Finn and the gang visited during their search for Tree Trunk's apples. Adventure Time's bit-by-bit method of world-building is probably its single greatest attribute in my opinion, which is why it's so disappointing to see it neutered in the midst of such a drastic development in the world's setting. Aside from satisfying world-building and overall investment in the plot, another victim of Season 10's horrendous pacing is the 3 main villains that barely even get to exist before they're reconciled with and shut down in the finale. Unlike the King of Ooo, who obviously exists as primarily comic relief and a temporary roadblock to the status quo, Gumball is clearly meant to be seen as a legitimate threat and foil in the road of Bonnie's character. In the finale, the show tries to frame Gumball and Bonnie as equals. If you try to look at each of their actions objectively, that's more or less true. However, I always felt that the fact was never quite believable to the audience. Gumball is never seen in the show as having any real passions aside from ruining Bubblegum's life. He and her other estranged family members are consistently painted as an antagonistic force, with barely any attributes helping to humanize them. And so the insistence that Gumball and Bubblegum are equally as awful has time and time again fallen flat for me, even within the harrowing dream sequence juxtaposing their experiences. Finn even has the realization that Gumball is awful in the episode leading up to the finale, so his sudden shift to being gung-ho peaceful mode again in the very next episode is a little bit of a strange decision to me. Because the audience knows absolutely nothing about Uncle Gumball except the many occasions he tries to screw over Bonnie, a character the audience has been allowed to extensively see both the good and bad parts of, it becomes very difficult to connect with an empathetic stance of his character, no matter how much logic may support it. This criticism regarding underdevelopment applies to his entire faction, of course, but Gumball is perhaps the greatest offense, second only to the Green Knight, but we'll get to that soon enough. It's honestly a shame how underutilized they were, because from what little we saw of them, they had very real potential both as a hilariously dysfunctional family dynamic and as a genuinely compelling depiction of toxic familial relationships, particularly in regards to the Green Knight. I could think of lots of ways that these villains and the threat that comes with them could be integrated more firmly in the narrative of Season 10, but I suppose we'll have to save that for another section. Because for right now, I have a very personal bone to pick, so here goes. So, first of all, I have a confession to make. This little essay of mine isn't only about Season 10 of Adventure Time. To be exact, one particular facet of the final season that bugs me probably the most is absolutely impossible to talk about without bringing up issues that begin with this character's first introduction in Season 8. Obviously, I mean to reference our very own volatile plant boy, Fern. As a bit of a disclaimer, I'm admitting now to more than a little bias on my part, because I do love Fern a lot, both as a character to analyze and to simply enjoy on a personal level. I also have a particular way I believe he is best interpreted and a specific vision of how his character could have been improved on. I am very passionate about that belief, but by no means am I going to pretend it's the only way he can or has been read by others. I try to be as objective as possible when it's necessary, but there are also a few times I just want to offer my own personal thoughts because it's just fun to discuss. Okay, now we can get into it. To start us off, I'll outline the main beats of Fern's character arc, and then I'll give my brief opinion of it as a whole. Fern is composed of the combined spirits of the Grass Sword and the Fin Sword, when they physically collided and later manifested into a humanoid form. The Grass Sword has a spirit that seems to be at least somewhat predispositioned to violence or other types of risky behavior, a trait that Fern shares, but seems ultimately harmless. An interesting tidbit I read about in the officially licensed Enchiridion book was that the Grass Sword also forms a long-lasting attachment to the person who wields it, which explains why it continuously seeks out Finn in the episode it debuted in, and continues to help him as part of his arm in future episodes. The Fin Sword, on the flip side, is literally another Finn as he manifests in the face of a time paradox in Is That You? It's unclear whether this Finn continues to gain the same memories as our Finn after turning into a sword, but Fern later seems to suggest that some of his memories as Finn are fuzzy to begin with.
Hi, Bonnie. Ah. I'm Fern. I kinda already know you. I have a lot of fuzzy half memories from when I was this guy.
Just keep the ones where she's our boss and forget everything else.
After discovering and allying with the Grass Sword, Finn loses his arm and then regains it, an event during which he also gains his thorn, which may manifest as a sword, a grass arm, and so on as it sees fit. It continues to help when needed, though it seems to do this of its own will rather than Finn's. This aligns with the sword's trait of lifelong bondage as stated in the Enchiridion. Eventually, the Grass Sword breaks the Fin Sword in a struggle, and the demon inside the Grass Sword restrains the consciousness of Finn that lives inside the Fin Sword. The being that results then escapes when given the opportunity, and takes on the memories of Finn, becoming who we know as Fern. After a brief and confusing confrontation, he retreats to what he remembers as his house. Finn and Jake later reason that Fern should be treated the same as Finn is, since he manifested from the Fin Sword. However, after an eventful trip to confront the Grass Sword's creator, the Grassy Wizard, Fern comes to the conclusion that they must be different people entirely. Fern then names himself and begins living in the treehouse with Finn and Jake. However, when Finn takes a trip to the human colony, he asks Fern to be a substitute for him while he's unable to protect Ew. Unfortunately, during that time, Patience St. Pym warps the content elementally. Fern later reveals that his failure to stop her is a major source of insecurity for him. During his interactions with Finn trying to protect Sweet Pea from the Lich, Fern observes that imitating Finn leads him to success, except of course for the times when he falls short of the original. He formulates a plan to eliminate Finn in order to become the only Finn, but it ultimately backfires and Finn ends up killing him instead. Uncle Gumbald finds Fern's remains and modifies him to become the Green Knight, with a strong body and an even stronger vendetta against Finn. After a brief confrontation at Finn's birthday party, they meet again in the group's shared nightmare during the Gum War. After a hostile exchange, Fern is reminded that they share fears, and they come to an understanding. Finn learns about the Grass Demon's involvement in Fern's existence, they slay it, and Fern dies, continuing to exist in a seed that will eventually become a large willow tree. In my opinion, Fern has a very solid and compelling character arc when you look at the primary points of it, especially looking at him in the lens of an anti-hero. He comes into being, rejects an identity that he was given, experiences a failure because of that, doubts himself and tries to conform, meets a tragic end, returns with a misplaced vengeance, and then just after he reconciles, he's finally laid to rest. Overall, I believe two things ultimately led to Fern's potential being squandered despite this promising outline of character arc. The first is a lack of screen time. Fern only has major appearances in 6 episodes, despite being arguably a pretty major character in all 3 of the latter seasons. While the episode count of these seasons is significantly shorter, I still think the amount of screen time Fern was allowed was disproportionate to his narrative weight as a character. For one, he's clearly a character that the audience is supposed to care for, yet he rarely had any scenes, much less episodes, outside of his arc that integrated his existence more organically into the world and characterized him in a more casual context. In other words, we barely had the time to get to know him before he was getting hurled into the next phase of his character arc. A great opportunity for this would have been following either of the miniseries in seasons 8 and 9, since Fern was completely absent from both of them and, in the case of the Element miniseries, was a catalyst for the events within, but that's probably a discussion for our Fix-It section. On the other hand, in terms of screen time, Fern's arc could have also benefited from having more pure emotional build-up at certain points. Whispers is a fantastic example of this. It's really great at getting the audience to understand why Fern takes the turn he does in his arc, which I'll also discuss a little later. However, in several portions of his story, it's a little difficult to empathize with what Fern is feeling because, due in part to his brief screen time, we're simply told what he feels or the matter isn't really explored to begin with. I think the worst offender of this is the Green Knight, who I think could have been a fascinating and imposing villain if he was allowed to actually act like one for more than 1 or 2 scenes in the show's final episodes. For example, in the finale, Fern seemed genuinely hurt and shocked that Gumbald would ditch him in the Nightmare Dimension. But we never really witnessed any indication that Fern and Gumbald had any sort of personal relationship outside of a business kind of, I'll help you fight the princess if you help me get revenge against the guy who gave me a crippling inferiority complex and killed me. Though omitting it gave us that great reveal in 17, we never really get to see how Fern rose to his mental state in that episode. Showing the audience how Fern's desire for acceptance can be taken advantage of would have also been a great opportunity to build Gumbald up as a more menacing villain if that's what they were going for. But again, I'm getting into Fix-It territory, which I'm trying to save for later. Anyway, as I said, aside from those disappointments regarding missed potential, my gripes with Fern's actual progression as a character are rather small. Something minor I could think of is a lack of real follow-up on his supposed redemption in the finale before he died. Like, he didn't have a speech or a fight scene or anything, but honestly, he only ever personally wronged Finn anyway, so it's not a huge deal. Moving on, my other issue I take with Fern is what I deem an unclear direction in regard to his role as a character. First and foremost, we can observe Fern as a plot device. Now, this isn't a negative term. Plot devices are absolutely necessary for literally any story, and this is objectively how Fern is used regardless of how you read him on a more narrative level. A whole bunch of other characters and events are plot devices on some level too. The last 3 seasons of the show needed a new villain. Our protagonist Finn needs to have a personal stake in the finale and the conflict as a whole. These kinds of objective concepts provide context as to why Fern's character progressed the way it did on a metatextual level. However, because Fern is a well-developed and well-utilized plot device, there's a bit more to him than that. Which brings me to how it's honestly a little difficult to discern how the writers wanted his character to be interpreted and perceived. To be more exact, it seems to me that there's a bit of a blurred line about whether Fern was meant to be his own character or simply representation of something. As a result of this lack of clarity, or even a lack of commitment, I think our overall impression of Fern's character suffers. Neither of the interpretations presented to us get fully explored, leaving both parties unsatisfied. Fern is established as his own character several times.
Good job, Grassme.
But I'm not you. It's clear that I'm someone else, and whatever I am, I'm not you.
But he is also implied to be a metaphor in relation to Finn.
This is just me talking, but it sounds like Fern was already headed down a dark road. Sounds like he was a bad version of yourself that you had to destroy in order to become an even tighter version of yourself. Does that sound about right?
This is also reflected in the manner Fern's character arc ends. The result is a more shallow, underdeveloped character as a whole. For the record, because these readings are sometimes contradictory to each other, I do subscribe to and personally favor one of these readings more than the other. However, I also think both of them had the potential to be equally compelling if they'd received the exclusive focus that they deserved. The most common and honestly most realistic reading I've seen of Fern as a metaphor is that he's supposed to represent a younger, more immature version of Finn that must be faced and overcome as he grows out of adolescence toward the end of the show. Fern is more violent and very emotionally charged, much like Finn used to be, and it makes sense to think of Fern's end also as a poetic end to Finn's character arc in the show. If you haven't guessed already, I prefer to think of Fern as his own person, but I actually really enjoy drawing this parallel separate from the text. However, the point isn't really how well this interpretation holds up, but rather how implementing it, literally in the show, affects the writing of Fern's character as a whole. As an aside, on a personal level, I disagree with the message that in order to come to terms with who we used to be, we have to get rid of that aspect and pretend it doesn't exist. I feel like this reading could have been more sensible if Fern was vilified more, but he's really not. It's hard for me to agree with that message when Fern was ultimately just grappling with the human emotions of self-hatred and insecurity. I believe the solution to those kinds of feelings isn't to demonize and forcibly purge them, it's to accept them, grow stronger, and carry on. It's just too bad that the writers wanted to have their cake with Fern and eat it too. I'm also not saying that trying to incorporate secondary symbolism in your story is a bad thing, but to me it certainly seems like there was a decision to disregard Fern's personhood in favor of this more abstract interpretation of his purpose in the story. Quite frankly, for many of the plot points critical to Fern's character arc, the crux of the matter relies on the realization that Fern and Finn are distinctly different, for better or for worse. Fern takes this realization pretty seriously at the end of Do No Harm, and he seems to maintain conviction in the belief until he's forced into a situation that shakes that conviction. Prior to the finale, I think he's pretty clearly painted as a victim of outside expectation and circumstance in terms of his inferiority complex, which is another reason I think it's a little bit of a strange decision for him to turn into Finn and die at the end of the show. So, let's discuss how Fern is an independent character and how the show goes out of its way to convey this fact to the audience. Not only do I think this way of approaching Fern's character is more interesting, but I also believe that this was the original direction his character was intended to proceed. Firstly, the Grass Demon is an important part of Finn too. It's a gut reaction to think that the Grass Demon is this super evil villain or something, but first of all, I honestly think that's a little bit beside the point. Fern doesn't seem to share the same concrete memories or motivations as the Grass Demon, despite it saying it would do the talking for them when he was created. After reconciling his memories from when he was Finn, Fern appears to operate on an entirely clean slate. He does, however, seem to share some more subtle traits, including his murderous and snarky tendencies. On that note, I now present to you the Grass Arm Sass Reel.
No mortal blade can harm. What?
Was that you or me? Thorn Arm, activate! You gonna help or what?
Let me finish my thought.
Stick you! Okay, go ahead. Dude, don't kill him! That's me, kinda! Oh.
What the crease?
You gonna get it now, dude! That's the grass sword! Ah!
Secondly, in regard to the grass demon being evil, given that Fern does not house the same consciousness as the grass demon, I don't think that directly blaming it for Fern's distress is entirely appropriate. Fern isn't emotionally unstable because the grass demon cursed him that way. He's emotionally unstable because of the burden of his very existence, which is another reason I think his fate clashes with the show thematically. In that context, it kind of feels like a mercy kill. But again, I digress. I'd like to point out again how Fern was fully convinced he was his own person up until a very, very specific point, when Finn asked him to be his replacement for the duration of the Islands and Element miniseries.
I came up here to ask a favor. I might be gone for a while on this trip, see? And I need someone to, cover for me, here and new.
Are you sure? I mean, Hero Biz is your whole thing. And whatever I am, I'm not you.
You can just do your own thing with it. Like, if some huge gross monster's gonna do murder on a bunch of innocents, kill it. But kill it you styles. Just don't go nuts.
Okay. I can handle that. Thanks for trusting me.
No, thank you, Fern.
The implication being that Fern did not intend to pursue being like Finn anymore. He didn't particularly want to be a hero. But because that responsibility was placed on him, and he failed at it, he began comparing himself to Finn again, which, as we know, spiraled into an intense inferiority complex. We first get a solid glimpse of this in the episode Whispers, where the two of them team up to help Sweet Pea and stop the Lich. Throughout the episode, Fern observes Finn solving issues and seeing more success than his own methods, which also continuously backfire throughout the episode. This creates something of a feedback loop. Fern fails, he sees what Finn does, which notably doesn't fail, he imitates Finn's way of doing things, and he succeeds. Or he fails to imitate it closely enough and fails again. You can even spot some of the more subtle instances he very consciously mirrors Finn's mannerisms in the background of some of the scenes. Fern's inferiority complex, which later blooms into a desire to get rid of Finn entirely, is entirely facilitated by continuous conditioning he receives that encourages his toxic mindset. This wasn't the grass demon being evil and telling him to do evil things like trying to take over Finn's life. It's a natural conclusion that Fern himself came to because of events in his life. Finn isn't aware, but by asking Fern to fill in for him, he sets Fern up to compare himself to him, and when he tries to guide him by suggesting he follow his lead, he sets Fern up to believe the only way to be successful is to imitate Finn. This is what I mean when I describe Fern's descent into inferiority as a tragedy. No one was really at fault, everyone was only pursuing what they thought was best, but misfortune befell Fern anyway. So I just talked about Fern for a really long time. But in a more general sense, for the last bit of the video, I think it would be fun to craft a little Fix-It segment for Season 10 and some of the details surrounding it. A good chunk of this is honestly based on my personal taste and ideas, so I would love to see how other people would tweak things if they had the opportunity. If you want to drop a comment, I'd love to throw different ideas around with other fans. Anyway, one thing I think we can all agree on is changing the total episode count for both Seasons 9 and 10, and personally, I think returning to the tried and true 26 episode season is the best option, maybe even a few more. Adventure Time has always told its plot in short spurts, so I think allotting an extra 10 episodes or so is reasonable, especially if the majority of them focus on building the setting of the conflict like I discussed in the first part of this video. Season 10 episodes as they are now almost entirely consist of tying up certain plot threads before the finale, which is fine and great. But because the season had very few episodes to begin with, it left the current plot even more bare, when its scale really deserves even more attention than a typical Adventure Time plot event. Along with developing this plot more, a larger episode count would also help with the overall pacing of the season. Also following up on my criticisms at the beginning of the video, I would love to see more presence from all of the main villains in Season 10. A great example we should have gotten more of was Chicle's participation in Hunson and Marcy, where he was a catalyst for a concrete conflict while there was growth happening with the characters we were already familiar with. I think this is a fantastic way to make the less complex villains like Chicle and Lolly feel like a more natural part of the story without having to flesh them out a ton. It also gives them a bit more of that fun personality and provides an opportunity to explore the opposing faction as a whole more deeply. Of course, I would also want Fern to have a more significant role as a villain in this section of the plot, but I'll start with my ideas for fixing his role in the story from the very beginning first. Of course, how you decide to fix Fern's character also depends on how you interpret his role as a character. As I mentioned before, I find the reading of Fern as his own independent person more interesting, so I'm following that vision in how I decide to continue with his character. Despite all my ranting about how Fern's writing felt confused, I still think his number one biggest issue is as simple as a lack of screen time. There are a few critical moments in his character's progression that feel entirely skimmed over, and he's absent for such a huge chunk of the show, it's hard to even say much about him outside his character arc. For the first point, I think an episode about Fern's failure in Element, or at least some kind of prequel or follow-up to Element that followed him, would have really sold his new developing inferiority complex, and it also would have been a great opportunity to see Fern exploring his new identity, yet still weighed down by the outside expectation that he had to be a hero like Finn. I also would have liked a bit more time with him before that responsibility was thrust on him, so we could spend time to know him before he was super tortured by inferiority. An episode working out his identity and aspirations would have been nice, but nothing concrete would be decided so as not to take away from the gone too soon tragedy later down the line. It also would have been nice to see Fern interacting with other characters outside of Finn more. I think Fern's snarky personality would make for some fun dynamics. Simply making him a recurring character in this kind of passive part of his arc honestly would have done wonders for making the audience sympathize with him more later down the line. I wouldn't change anything about how Fern's arc was handled from Whispers to 3 Buckets. I genuinely believe Whispers sufficiently conveyed Fern's worsening inferiority complex despite its short runtime. If I had to change anything, it would probably be to have just one more episode with Fern between those 2 episodes I mentioned before, even if he just had a small role, just to feel like the time between the realization and the execution wasn't so sudden. And because seeing Fern stewing with hatred that he's trying to hide for an entire episode would be pretty funny. But Adventure Time's plot progression is always pretty tight, so that's more of a personal wish of mine. More realistic would just be putting any old filler episode between Whispers and 3 Buckets. My biggest beef in terms of screen time is the Green Knight, which I also think most people will agree with me on. Like I talked about earlier, I would have loved more details regarding Fern's relationship with Gumball, and I honestly think a lot of this would come naturally once we started developing the setting of Gumbaldia and the other Season 10 villains more. I also talked earlier about painting Gumball as a more villainous and intelligent character through the angle of how he has more or less took advantage of Fern's insecurities to further his own goals. It would have been so interesting to see how much exactly Fern had been warped being under Gumball's command, because it's clear his feelings of resentment toward Finn had only worsened, and his inferiority complex had twisted into some pretty heavy arrogance once he was modified by Gumball. Showcasing Fern's loyalty to Gumball despite how evil he was supposed to be would also be a great way to make Gumball seem morally gray too, even if he turns out not to be. Furthermore, as a recurring villain, I think the Green Knight himself would be a great plot device in order to learn more about Gumbaldia. Though the Green Knight is pretty hostile towards Finn, we see in the episode Gumbaldia there's also a side of him that can be swayed towards sympathy, and Finn is certainly adamant about not wanting the two of them to fight. If there was room for a temporary truce between them, it would open up opportunities for both Finn and the audience to learn more about both Gumball and Gumbaldia, either by directly visiting or hearing about it offhand. This kind of dynamic also allows for Fern to be painted in a more sympathetic light prior to his redemption in the finale, and I personally just kind of enjoy the trope of the villain letting the hero go free because of a fleeting loss of resolve. It's fun, it's dramatic, and I think this kind of villainy would be quite fitting for Fern. One direct change I would make to Fern's actual character arc is how it ends in the finale. As much as I'd like to embrace a kind of accept your past self and don't feel ashamed of it theme that I think Fern living would exemplify, I do think the act of Fern dying is an important part of Finn's character arc, facing the fact that he can't save everyone and losing someone important to him. But I think certain circumstances about it should have been different so that his progression up until that point didn't feel so pointless and disrespected. If you remember how much I talked earlier about the theming of Fern's death, you might have an idea about how I would change those circumstances. For one, the idea that the grass demon needs to be removed in order for Fern to be at peace doesn't really add up thematically in a couple different ways if you think of Fern as his own person, as I discussed earlier. On a personal note, I also think it's kind of silly and shoehorned in that the actions in a dream sequence actually have the power to change Fern's physicality in the real world, but I'm willing to chalk that up to plot convenience and wave it off. Since the grass demon being defeated is critical to the manner in which Fern dies, I think that itself should remain. What's important is that it's not framed in a way that implies it's the morally correct thing to do, like it was originally. For example, there could be an ultimatum that requires it be killed, they could be tricked into killing it, it could be a simple accident, any number of ways. Maybe these particular examples wouldn't be as climactic as Finn deciding to kill the grass demon by his own hands, but I think any of them would be more consistent with how Fern had been framed in the show thus far. By the way, like I said, you're free to interpret Fern's character differently. I just think that ending Fern's arc in the manner the show originally did disrespected his integrity as an independent person, which in my opinion is inconsistent with how his character had progressed up until that point. I think there definitely is a way to keep the original scene, but you'd have to change a bunch of other stuff about how his character is framed earlier in the show, and like I said, I think the other way is much more interesting. Wow, to be completely honest, I think I could probably go on for a good while longer, but I think I've sufficiently summed up most of my thoughts regarding Adventure Time Season 10, and especially regarding Fern. This is the first video essay I've seen all the way through, even though I rant all the time on Twitter about media analysis. I don't even know if this video is going to reach anyone since I originally posted lyric videos to OnStar songs on this channel, but I've been way too passionate about this topic and I wanted a way to put all of my thoughts into words. It would be really cool to make more videos discussing Adventure Time as well as other stuff I'm into, so if that's something you're interested in, please let me know. If enough people would want to see it, then maybe my executive dysfunction will subside enough for me to finish more things like this. I also have a Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram that are linked in the description if you also feel alone in how abnormally much you think about Fern Adventure Time. Maybe we can be friends. Anyway, that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed it, make sure to like the video so hopefully more people can see it and I'll feel less like I'm talking at a wall. My name is Mexi, and goodbye for now.